Fluorescent bulbs buzzed overhead like dying wasps above the triage desk. Leora stared at the lukewarm coffee in her styrofoam cup, counting the minutes until dawn. Then, without warning, automatic gunfire shredded the glass doors. For armed men stormed into the expecting terrified civilians. They had no idea who was really on shift that night. The fluorescent lights in County General's emergency room didn't just hum, they vibrated straight into your teeth. The air always carried the same grim cocktail during the late hours: industrial bleach, stale urine, and the bitter bite of burnt coffee. Leora leaned against the medication cart, absently rubbing her left knee. The joint ached whenever the weather shifted. A permanent souvenir from a botched static line jumped over a blacked-out valley in Afghanistan years earlier. She was in her mid-30s now, dressed in faded blue scrubs that smelled of cheap lavender detergent and the comfortable ugliness of nursing clogs. Her brown hair was scraped into a messy bun, held together by tension and a single plastic clip. She looked exactly like what the world expected her to be: an overworked, underpaid night nurse simply counting down the hours until she could collapse into her unmade bed. Dr. Harlan was complaining about his second ex-wife's alimony demands, his voice a droning monotone that blended with the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor in trauma too. Leland, a young orderly barely out of his teens, sat on a plastic chair near the entrance, mindlessly scrolling through his phone while his jaw worked a piece of bubble gum in steady rhythm. It was utterly mundane. Leora hated it, and yet she clung to it with quiet desperation. Nursing was supposed to be her penance after a decade of taking lives, of operating in the murky, violent shadows. As one of the first women integrated into the Navy SEALs and later pulled into Tier 1 task forces, she had wanted to mend bodies instead of breaking them. She had traded the freezing surf of Coronado and the oppressive heat of Fallujah for the sterile chill of a city hospital. Then, in a single shattering instant, the reinforced safety glass of the main entrance exploded into a million glittering diamonds. The sound didn't register as gunfire to the civilians. Dr. Harlan jumped, spilling his chart across the floor. Leland dropped his phone, but Leora's body recognized the concussive, ripping crack of a short-barreled rifle indoors long before her conscious mind caught up. Muscle memory seized control. She didn't gasp. She didn't scream. She dropped instantly, folding herself small and sliding behind the heavy steel frame of the medication cart just as a second burst of fire chewed through the drywall where she had been standing seconds before. Plaster dust bloomed into the air, coating the back of her throat with chalky dryness. Heavy boots crunched over shattered glass. For men, nobody moves. Everybody on the ground. A voice roared. The leader, let's call him Vance. He sounded breathless, riding a dangerous mix of adrenaline and cheap amphetamines. Leora didn't peek over the cart. She pressed her cheek to the cold linoleum and looked beneath the gap. She saw their footwear, scuffed combat boots unlaced at the tops, mud caked in the treads. They moved wide, trying to appear tactical, but their spacing was sloppy. They were clustered to tightly an easy spray and pray target. Where is he? Vance screamed. Where's the guy the ambulance brought in earlier? The one with the gunshot wound to the shoulder. A cartel hit, Leora realized. Or gang retaliation. They had come to finish the job. Dr. Harlan was on his knees, hands trembling violently in the air. I don't know who you mean. We have multiple. A dull thud echoed through the lobby as Vance drove the butt of his rifle into Dr. Harlan's jaw. The doctor collapsed, spitting teeth and garbled moans. Leland whimpered and curled into a fetal position near the waiting room chairs. Leora lay perfectly still, her heart beat a steady, rhythmic drumline against her ribs. It wasn't the frantic flutter of panic. It was the cold, mechanical thump of an engine turning over. A toxic surge of adrenaline flooded her system. She squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want this. She had walked away. She had handed in her trident, packed her locker, and sworn she was finished with the copper scent of violence. She wanted to stay hidden. She wanted to let the police handle it. But the police were still several minutes away. Those minutes were an eternity inside a gunfight. These men were amateurs, and amateurs were infinitely more dangerous than professionals because they panicked. If they didn't find their target soon, they would start executing hostages simply to bleed off the tension. "Check the back rooms," Vance ordered, racking the charging handle of his weapon. "Silas, watch the door. Rafa, clear those hallways. Shoot anyone who runs." Footsteps scattered. One set of heavy boots turned toward the corridor where Leora hid. She inhaled slowly through her nose, held the breath low in her diaphragm, and released it through pursed lips. The ache in her knee vanished, overridden by the chemical flood in her brain. The tired, cynical nurse dissolved into the sterile, humming air. The operator woke up. She crawled backward in absolute silence on hands and knees, slipped around the corner into the darkened supply corridor, and melted into the shadows just as Rafa rounded the bend. The supply corridor was a narrow tunnel lined with metal racks that smelled sharply of rubbing alcohol and the metallic tang of packaged gauze. The fluorescent lights were motion-activated. Leora stayed low, hugging the wall to avoid triggering them. She needed a weapon. Her eyes scanned the dark shelves. A scalpel was useless to brittle. No stopping power against heavy clothing. A fire extinguisher was too heavy to swing quickly. Her hand brushed a tall green cylinder. An oxygen tank, solid steel, narrow enough to grip, heavy enough to crush a skull. She wrapped her fingers around the cold neck of the valve and lifted. It weighed a solid 15 pounds. Perfect. Footsteps squeaked on the freshly waxed linoleum. Rafa moved slowly, breathing jagged and loud. He reeked of stale weed, cheap body spray, and the sour edge of fear. He was young, probably no older than 22, holding a modified Glock with a high-capacity magazine. His finger rested inside the trigger guard. A fatal mistake if he stumbled, yet deadly for anyone who surprised him. Leora wedged herself between two supply racks, spine pressed to the cold wall. She closed her eyes and visualized the hallway geometry. 3 steps to the intersection. He would clear the corner first. "Don't do this," a small, exhausted voice whispered in her head. Just let him walk past. But Rafa stopped at the edge of the racks. He raised his flashlight. The beam swept across boxes of saline. One more step and he would see her shoulder. Leora didn't think. She acted. She stepped from the shadows, left hand slapping the Glock's barrel upward toward the ceiling. Rafe's eyes widened, flashing white in the dim light. He pulled the trigger in pure shock. The gunshot roared in the confined space, punching a hole through the acoustic tiles and raining asbestos dust over them both. At the same instant, Leora drove the base of the oxygen tank straight into his leading kneecap. The sickening crunch of cartilage and bone was lost beneath the ringing in her ears, but she felt the joint collapse. Rafa screamed, leg buckling. As he dropped, she swung the tank upward and caught him under the chin. It wasn't a clean, cinematic knockout. His teeth slammed together violently, but he stayed conscious. He thrashed wildly, free hand clawing at her face, frantic, fighting with the unpredictable strength of a trapped animal. They crashed to the hard linoleum. Rafa was heavier. He dropped his full weight onto her chest. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. He drove an elbow down into her cheekbone. White-hot pain exploded behind her eyes. Leora tasted copper. She didn't punch back. Punches shattered knuckles. Instead, she released the oxygen tank, reached up, and drove both thumbs into the soft tissue of his throat, just above the collarbone. Rafa gagged and dropped the gun to claw at her wrists. His fingernails tore into her forearms, drawing warm, wet lines down her sleeves. He choked on his own spit, eyes bulging. Leora wrapped her legs around his waist, shifted her hips, and used his panic momentum against him. With a sharp twist, she rolled them over, claiming the top position. The floor was slick with his sweat. She pinned his right arm beneath her knee, grabbed a fistful of greasy hair, and slammed the back of his head against the linoleum once, twice. Rafe's eyes rolled back. His body went limp, his bladder released, the sharp scent of urine mixing with the rubbing alcohol. Leora pushed off him, chest heaving. She wiped spit and blood from her cheek with shaking hands. It wasn't fear causing the tremors. It was the adrenaline crash, the violent lurch from stillness into brutality. She leaned against the supply rack, breathing hard, staring at the unconscious young man on the floor. She hated this. She hated how easily the violence returned, like riding a bicycle through a minefield. She had spent years learning how to talk to people, how to check vitals, how to hold a frightened hand. In mere moments, she had become a weapon again. Down the hall, Vance's voice echoed, muffled but furious. Rafa. What the hell was that shot? Rafa. Leora looked at the Glock on the floor, heavy, ugly, and glinting in the low light. She picked it up. She racked the slide, ejected the chambered round, and let a fresh one chamber. 14 rounds. She found a spare magazine in Rafe's pocket and slipped it into her scrubs beside her pen light and trauma shears. Rafa. Answer me, you stupid son of a bitch. Leora clicked the safety off. The soft metallic snick sounded deafening in the quiet corridor. She stepped over Rafe's unconscious form, nursing clogs silent on the linoleum. She rolled her shoulders, ignoring the throbbing in her cheek and the stinging scratches on her arms. She wasn't a hero. She was simply a tired nurse who wanted to finish her shift. And these armed fools were standing between her and a cold beer. She melted back into the shadows and moved toward the lobby, spine pressed to the drywall, gritty plaster just clinging to the sweat on her neck. The triage desk looked like a shipwreck. Papers lay scattered like dead leaves. A shattered monitor sparked intermittently, trailing a thin ribbon of gray smoke that smelled of fried electronics and ozone. Silas was the immediate problem. He stood near the shattered entrance, weight shifting foot to foot, rifle aimed lazily toward the street. Dexter was ransacking the cabinets in Trauma 1, hurling boxes of gauze and saline bags onto the floor while cursing violently. Vance paced a tight circle around Dr. Harlan, kicking a rolling stool aside with a frustrated snarl. They were unraveling. The initial adrenaline of the breach had faded, leaving them jittery and paranoid. Leora tightened her grip on the Glock. Her palms were slick. The weapon felt unbalanced in her hands. She was used to custom grips and meticulously maintained firearms, not this street-modified junk that rattled when tilted. Her left knee pulsed with a dull, sickening rhythm. Adrenaline was a liar. It masked pain for the first minutes, but once the chemical spike faded, the body's debt came due. Her hands trembled not from fear, but from the raw exhaustion of a body inked from stillness into survival. She forced her breathing into a rigid box, for seconds in, for hold, for out. Silas had an angle on the hallway. If she stepped out to deal with Vance, Silas would cut her down before she could swing her aim. She needed a distraction. Her foot brushed a heavy steel bedpan near a linen cart. She hooked her to beneath the rim and kicked it hard down the side corridor. It skidded across linoleum with a horrific metallic screech that bounced off the walls. Silas snapped toward the sound, boots squeaking. Who's there? He stepped into the corridor, weapon raised, peering into the gloom. Completely focused on the noise, he had abandoned the front doors. Leora didn't attempt a clean cinematic headshot. That was how people missed under pressure. She aimed center mass, following the oldest, ugliest rule, put rounds on the largest available target. She stepped wide of the corner, leveled the pistol, and fired twice. The noise inside the enclosed wing was catastrophic. The concussive wave slapped her eardrums, replacing the ER's background hum with a high, agonizing whine. Silas grunted as both rounds slammed into his chest armor. The cheap Kevlar stopped penetration, but the blunt trauma was devastating. He didn't fly backward. His knees simply gave way and he folded inward, collapsing in a heap of limbs and gear. He gasped, completely winded, dropping his rifle as he clutched fractured ribs. Leora didn't hesitate. She closed the distance in 3 strides and kicked the rifle far out of reach. Before he could draw a breath to scream, she brought the heavy base of the Glock down hard against his temple. Silas went limp, forehead striking the floor with a dull thud. To down, to left, The echo of the shots threw the triage area into chaos. Silas. Vance roared, voice cracking. He spun, grabbed Leland by the collar, and hauled the terrified orderly off the floor. He jammed the rifle barrel under the boy's chin. Who the hell is shooting? Rafa? Silas. Dexter burst from trauma 1. Eyes wide and frantic. Cops. Did the cops breach? There are no sirens. You idiot. Vance screamed, spinning in a circle with the sobbing teenager as a human shield. Someone's still in here. Leora hated this. She hated the noise, the ringing in her ears, and these men for dragging her back into this headspace. She ducked behind a heavy supply cart loaded with 4 bags. Chest heaving. Her cheekbone throbbed where Rafa had struck her. The skin was already tight and swelling. She wiped sweat from her forehead and left a faint crimson smear from torn knuckles. She needed to separate them. Vance was dug in behind Leland. Dexter stood exposed in the trauma bay doorway, weapon sweeping erratically. Leora grabbed a 1-liter bag of saline from the bottom shelf, heavy, dense, tightly pressurized. She tossed it over the cart toward the ceiling tiles, directly above Dexter's head. As the bag arced through the air, she leaned around the opposite side and fired once into the plastic. The bag exploded like a water balloon. A heavy shower of sterile fluid rained over Dexter's head and shoulders. Startled, he flinched wildly, arms flying up to protect his face from what he thought was falling debris. It was a 2-second window. Leora took it. She burst from cover, ignoring the flare of pain in her knee. Dexter tried to bring his rifle down, blinded and off balance. Leora didn't shoot too close, too great a risk of a pass-through round hitting an oxygen line. Instead, she closed the gap, grabbed the hot barrel with her left hand, and shoved it violently toward the ceiling. With her right, she drove the Glock's frame squarely into his sternum. Bone cracked. Dexter wheezed, eyes bulging as every ounce of air left his lungs. Leora swept her right leg behind his calf and shoved. He went down backward with a heavy, wet slap. She dropped her weight onto his chest, forearm across his throat. No time for a long struggle. She drove her knee upward into his groin. Dexter's eyes rolled back, mouth open in a silent scream, and his grip on the weapon vanished. Leora stripped the rifle away, tossed it beneath a nearby gurney, and rolled off him, gasping. 3 down. 1 to go. I'll kill him. Vance shrieked, voice echoing off the tiles. I swear. She grabbed fistfuls of his jacket and used her momentum to drag him to the floor. They scrambled across the slick linoleum. Vance swung a wild punch that caught her on the jaw. Her vision flared white. Nausea rolled through her stomach. Fresh copper flooded her mouth. Enough. Lio snatched a heavy metal 3-hole punch that had fallen from the desk. She swung it backward and drove the steel corner straight into Vance's temple. The sound was dull and final. His eyes rolled back. His body went instantly slack. His head hit the floor and he lay still, chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Leora dropped the whole punch. It clattered in the sudden, eerie silence. She rolled off him and collapsed onto her back, staring at the acoustic ceiling tiles. The fluorescent lights vibrated against her retinas. Her chest heaved. Every muscle in her body burned with deep, relentless intensity. Leland. She wheezed, eyes still on the ceiling. You okay? Leland knelt near the wall, massaging his bruised throat, weeping opally. He nodded, unable to speak, staring at her with a mixture of raw terror and absolute awe. Dr. Harlan slowly sat up and peeked over the edge of the desk. He looked at Vance, then at Dexter down the hall, then at Leora wiping dirt and fluid from her swollen face. Leora, he whispered, voice trembling. What did you just do? Leora sat up slowly, joints popping. She reached up, pulled the broken plastic clip from her hair, and let the messy brown strands fall around her shoulders. She took in the wreckage, shattered glass, ruined equipment, for unconscious gunmen scattered across her ward. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, cutting through the heavy silence of the night. Leora dragged herself to the triage desk. Right at a fallen rolling chair, sat heavily, and reached for her styrofoam cup. The coffee was cold, bitter, and tasted like ash. She took a sip anyway. I need a vacation, she muttered, staring at the shattered front doors. And I am definitely not cleaning this up. If this intense, gritty story got your pulse racing, you won't want to miss what we create next. Hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves grounded, realistic thrillers, and subscribe to the channel right now. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when our next heavy-hitting series drops. What would you have done in Leora's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and join the discussion.